Okay, so just to back up a little bit, that was the last slide we covered. Last time we were on Chapter 07, World War II. Was it Part 1 or was it Part 2? It was Part 2? Shucks. Okay, so that means this is Chapter 7, World War II, Part 3. So we finished this slide, slide number 12. So if I recall correctly, we watched one of those videos. I'm going to watch this one. Like I said, there are several movies about the Battle of Britain.
For those who fought in the Battle of Britain, it was a battle for survival. For the free world, it was a breathless moment in...
Shucks, I didn't get my...
For those who fought in the Battle of Britain, it was a battle for survival. For the free world, it was a breathless moment in history. For failure would have plunged mankind into a new dark age. Never have so many owed so much to so few.
I presume that there is no one who would deny that England should fight on, even though the remainder of the continent of Europe is dominated by the Germans.
What's left of your army, with bands and weapons, is Dunkirk. You're defenseless and just playing for time. Europe is ours. We can walk into Britain whenever we like.
Don't threaten or dictate to us until you're marching up Whitehall.
The war in France was over. The Battle of Britain was about to begin.
2 seconds, Trevor!
Don't just stand there, get one up!
Faced with certain defeat, fighting against insuperable forces, a miracle was achieved by a courageous few.
Is everything up? The lot, sir.
The German military machine, a formidable enemy of thousands of planes, a sure weapon of mass destruction against a small and undermanned force. Yet the story of the RAF in the Battle of Britain is the modern David and Goliath. Never has a motion picture captured the mood, the feelings, the terror. It's all there. The courage, the fears, the frustrations.
We've got the Rosencrantz. He'll have to drink at the Red Lion there, won't he?
The people, the men and women who recreated vividly and realistically one of the great periods of our time.
We're fighting for survival. Losing. We need pilots. And a miracle.
Okay. All right, darn, that's the end of that slide. So presentation, so now I have to go to a different one. World War II. Some more. Microsoft PowerPoint. It stopped working. Neener, neener, neener. All right, so this is really, get rid of it. Let's not have to put that B in there. That's confusing. There we go. So this is World War II, Section 7, Part 3, the real beginning. All right. So the last time we left off at the end of World War II, Part 2, was Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the reasons why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So now the United States entered World War II. You can go online and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the person who was the President of the United States, on December 7th of 1941, gave an address. Then in a day or two right after that, a day that will live in infamy. The Japanese attacked a military installation in Hawaii. At that time, Hawaii was a territory of the United States, not a state. But the United States had Army Air Corps bases. I think they had a Marine Corps base. And they certainly had the Pearl Harbor Navy base inside of a very big harbor on the island of Oahu, which is still right now the most populated island in the Hawaiian chain. And of course, it was December 7th, 1941. And almost every every weapon that was expended by the Japanese onto the territory of Hawaii was from an aircraft carrier-based airplane. They dropped bombs, they strafed with bullets, and they had torpedo planes and dropped torpedoes into the bay so their torpedo would keep going and then hit the ships. So this is rather significant in that it was the first major naval battle where air power was doing all of the attacking. Of course, the Navy sustained major losses. Several battleships were destroyed or knocked out of commission for months or if not years. A lot of other ships got destroyed. The only saving grace for the United States Navy is that all the United States Navy's aircraft carriers that had been in the Pacific were not, none of them were at Pearl Harbor. And this is a really big deal because those aircraft carriers pretty soon here in the war took the fight back to the Japanese Navy, and you can, there's a couple of good movies, the Battle of Midway, and you can see where U.S. aircraft carriers fought Japanese aircraft carriers, and 100% of the attacking from both sides was from an air carrier-based airplane attacking the opposite side's aircraft carriers. So a boatload of things happened in World War I, as in advances in aviation. Some of them only applied towards war making, but some of those advances applied towards just aviation in general. Like in World War I, they built dedicated bombers. Well, that means they built really big airplanes that could carry a heavy load and fly a long way. You could carry people and cargo instead of bombs with that kind of an airplane. And in fact, the Vickers-Vimy was used to fly across the North Atlantic, the first non-stop across the North Atlantic in an airplane. In any case, in World War II, I put jet engines, although one could argue maybe I needed to put that last because that came towards the end of the war. Both the Germans and the English, you don't have to write that down, but both the Germans and the English both developed jet engines separately during the course of World War II, or maybe I should say they got designed and then got built and flew in World War II. When I say rockets, I'm talking about the kind of rocket that takes off from the ground and it has a warhead and flies across the English Channel and lands in somebody else's country. I'm not talking rockets off the wing of an airplane to shoot something on the ground that's only 1,000 yards away. I'm talking a rocket airplane, a rocket ship that'll go hundreds and hundreds of miles. In the United States, it was felt back in the late 30s, there early 40s, was that women couldn't be in combat. In fact, there were no women in combat, effectively no women in combat in the United States military back then. So you couldn't use women in combat airplanes, but in the United States, women who were pilots or got trained as pilots flew around the United States. They flew at the factories, and they flew combat airplanes across the United States, and even some of them flew them across the North Atlantic to get them to Great Britain. They still weren't, the women weren't authorized to be in combat, but they were flying the combat airplane machines. Of course, if you've ever heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, there's two Hollywood movies out there, at least one with Lawrence Fishburne from 10 or 15 years ago. I think it was actually called the Tuskegee Airmen. And then there's another movie, Red Tails. Is that the one that with Cuba Gooding Jr.? Was he in the latest version, the one called Red Tails? Yes? Okay, all right. So there was another brand new thing that hadn't been occurring in the United States Armed Forces, were black Americans being allowed to fly combat aircraft. Navy warfare. This is one of the, if you had to argue about what are the top 5 things that happened in World War II in aviation, one of those top 5 would be that naval battles changed from being a ship attacking another ship with a big giant gun, like battleship to battleship, to a ship with airplanes attacking another ship, but you don't attack them with cannons, you attack them with airplanes. So that's when I say up there, naval warfare becomes an air war. And to this day, if you look at what the United States has, does anybody know how many aircraft carriers does the United States have? More than all of the entire rest of the planet added together. There are more aircraft carriers in the United States Navy than all of the other nations on the planet added together. And the reason why the United States Navy has so many aircraft carriers is because that's how you can do several things. In particular, you can take your weapon to the enemy hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and you can do it really fast because you just hang out offshore 200-300 miles. You can go off in a 500 or 600, 800 or 900 mile an hour jet. You can drop bombs and launch missiles and shoot bullets and then come back, and you can go neener, neener, neener. I mean, I hope nobody's going neener, neener, neener. That's a joke. But that was arguably one of the big advances. I'd probably put jet engines up there as one of the big things. Pressurized airplanes. When I say pressurized airplanes, if you're used to flying little tiny airplanes, they leak air like a car. In fact, most cars keep out more of the outside air than most little tiny airplanes. I got an 07 Prius that's got an air filter. When a door's shut, there's a rubber gasket all the way around all the doors. And if I go to recirculate on my air conditioning, I get almost no outside air into the aircraft cabin. And I get almost no outside air into the car at all. And what air does go through the car, change it to say fresh air, that fresh air goes through a filter. Yeah, they leak. They leak like crazy. So whatever the pressure is on the outside of the airplane, that's the pressure on the inside of the airplane. Those airplanes are not pressurized, or another way to describe them is they are unpressurized. The downside of that is when you go up to higher altitudes, you've got to start using oxygen. And at some point, even using 100% oxygen isn't enough. And it's also tiring to have to use oxygen. It dries you out because oxygen tanks have to have 0 water in it. And so you're breathing in as dry air as humans can generate. So it dehydrates you. So there's a lot of downsides to having to use oxygen. And what if you run out of oxygen? So they're also a little unhappy about that. So if you have a pressurized airplane, wait, I forgot. It's cold up there. Let's say you're flying in World War II and you're at 25,000 feet. If we use a standard lapse rate of 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000, and we start at sea level at 15 degrees, every 10 degrees it goes down by 20. So we go to 10,000, it's 15 minus 20, we're at minus 5 Celsius. We go from 10 to 20, that's another minus 20, so now we're at minus 5. Subtract another 20, we're at minus 25 Fahrenheit, and we're only at 20,000 feet. Minus 25 Celsius, let's see, it's like 5 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 degrees, minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit, I don't know what it is, but it's ridiculously cold. So if you have a machine gun on the side of an airplane, and you have a window to stick the machine gun out, think about it, you're going 200 or 300 miles an hour. You think it's windy in that gunner compartment right there? It's crazy. If you watch the World War II movies, they got all these wool clothes on and hats, and they're freezing because it's stinking. They got gloves on because it's too. Think about the wind chill with a 200-mile-an-hour wind, and it's minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So having pressurized airplanes also kept the people inside of the airplane from having to be ridiculously cold. Autopilots became very commonplace in World War II. It's not that every airplane had an autopilot, and we're not going to go into it, but even a B-17 bomber in 1943, taking off out of England and flying and dropping bombs over France and Germany, they had an autopilot, so that during the bomb run, the pilot actually let go of the control wheel, and the bombardier was aiming the airplane with a bombing sight, and that was actually turning the airplane to aim the airplane, because bombing was more accurate if the bombardier was the one steering it using an autopilot. So autopilot came into, not that every airplane had autopilots, but autopilots became commonly used by the end of World War II. Oh wait, a whole nother list. So while you're writing that down, I'm going to tell you a couple of things think about World War I. Lots and lots of things happened. And for the same reason in World War I, they happened in World War II, is because people were, maybe I need to say it this way, governments were very motivated to have better weapons. And weapons in World War I, and now especially in World War II, airplanes were weapons. So if you wanted a better airplane weapon, you made better airplanes. So lots of government money was spent in lots of countries on both sides of the fighting to develop airplanes that would fly faster and fly farther and could carry more bullets or more bombs or more cargo and were less likely to get, made it harder to get shot down by other aircraft. So just advancement after advancement after advancement occurred. Hey, I just thought of another idea. In private pilot ground school, everybody's going to have to come up with a topic, and I listed some the other day, and a couple of people asked for them. I'm going to put down one of them as development of the helicopter. You would like that one? Imagine that. I was waiting to write it down, then I was going to look at it, but I didn't have to wait. So you won't be able to put too much detail in it because the paper isn't very long. Because the minimum is 300, but the maximum is 600. So don't turn in like a 10-page paper. You promise? You promise? Okay, all right. Well, one of those things you're going to find there, Rodrigo, is that both Germany and the United States built helicopters, not just a prototype, just one, but they mass-produced them. In the United States, we built more than they did in Germany. But Germany, we were bombing the snot out of them in the second half of the war. No one was bombing the United States in the second half of the war. We had all of our snot. Because nobody was bombing the snot out of us. Okay, nobody's laughing at that one. Fine. All right, so I'm going to go through these one at a time here. De-icing. If you want to kill the people on the other side of the war, you want to be able to fly no matter how bad the weather is, right? Yeah, okay, we have one air marshal right here. He's shaking his head because if he was general in World War II, he was in charge of the air forces. He would want to kill the other people on the other side of the war, even when the weather was bad. Of course, you just want to kill them in general, right? Isn't that what you're trying to do? Or if you don't kill them, at least wound them so they can't fight. So if you had your way, you just wound them all. The problem is, in the course of wounding people, you probably kill some of them, right? Yeah. Okay, well, we don't have to talk about the pros of war today. All right, but you want to fly through the bad weather, you're going to fly at altitudes and through near thunderstorms, not through them. Don't fly through thunderstorms. But near enough that you might get ice stuck to the airplane. and we won't go into all the details, but if ice sticks to the wing, it won't get enough lift. If ice sticks to the airplane's too heavy and it descends. If ice sticks to the propellers, it won't generate as much thrust. You can see that there's some real problems with ice. So people had de-icing equipment before the war, but now people were used to putting de-icing equipment on lots and lots of airplanes. In fact, if it was a bomber or a big transport airplane, it had de-icing. If ice formed on it, you could break the ice off so they could keep flying. Turbo supercharger. There was turbo supercharging, and a pump to pump air into the engine. This was available before in the 1930s, but lots of airplanes did not use that. And in fact, it's in somebody's report, the first P-51 Mustang that was produced, I think it was North American. Maybe North American? Okay. They built it, and it had an airplane that, did it have a turbo supercharger on it at all, or it was just a really small one? I can't remember. Yeah, it didn't, and so... Yeah, didn't they put on a different engine? Got one from Rolls-Royce in England? A Merlin, yeah, and it had a turbo supercharger on it. So this became very common. In fact, by the end of World War II, if it was big enough that it held more than 10 people, or it was a fighter plane, or it was a bomber, it had air pumps on it. It had turbo supercharging on it, because you could get a lot more horsepower out of an engine without it weighing too much. Paratroopers. You could write a whole paper about paratrooping during World War II. The Germans did it once or twice successfully and once or twice unsuccessfully. The United States also did it on more than one occasion. But you fly over enemy territory and you push a bunch of soldiers out with bullets and guns and grenades and stuff, and you go, thanks, see you later, and you're flying the airplane. You turn around and go home, and go have some tea or crumpets or whatever at the end of the flight. But those poor people jumping out of airplanes. So this was never done in war until World War II. Same thing for combat gliders. The nice thing about combat gliders is they're cheap because they don't have engines on them. You're only going to use them once or twice, so they don't have to last so long. They can wear out. They're never going to wear out because you're going to break them up. But you tow them behind another airplane, and that thing is full of troops, so they don't have to be trained on how to jump with parachutes, and they can land behind enemy lines or right next to the enemy lines and jump out and start shooting. They even made combat gliders big enough to put a Jeep in them. In fact, I think a British version, you could put 2 Jeeps in it. But it was like paratrooping. You could get a whole bunch of troops right smack where you wanted. And these gliders would literally land in a field, hopefully when there was a moon so they could see they were going. The downside of combat gliders is sometimes they crashed and killed people. There were radar sporadically around all places during World War II. But if you see 100 planes up there, by the time you launch a fighter and say, go get them, even if you're talking to them on the radio, that airplane has moved. And the big airplane that's made out of aluminum, it's flown away, and the glider may have a lot less metal in it and doesn't reflect the radar as well. And you're going to let go of them at low altitude. So I'm not a super expert on the beginnings of radar, and I'm sure it helped shoot some things down, including gliders. But using ground-based radar to look up and find the airplanes and then direct a fighter up there to shoot it down, it's not that this wasn't happening in World War II, but nobody was very good at it yet. Most bombing was strategic. You need to understand the difference between tactical bombing or tactics and strategy. Let's see. Tactics is when the coach at first base playing baseball is giving signals to his runner on first base and telling them when to steal second. That's in the moment, the very next step you're going to take, and it has a small impact on the entire baseball game. Strategy is how do you put together your lineup of who's going to hit. Who's a big hitter, who's a lousy hitter, because that you're going to be stuck with that lineup the whole game. Is that not correct? Except for pinch hitters, I'm not a big, giant baseball. But you say, here's the 9 people. Is it 9? Okay, one person says 9. Great, so somebody knows baseball. You put up this list of these 9 players. Now they go out and they go field, but now they got to come in and they got to hit. But once you set that lineup, you can't rearrange it whenever you want the rest of the game. So you have to strategize. How is this going to work in the first inning, the second inning, the third inning, the fourth inning, the fifth inning, not knowing what's really going to be at that moment. You're going to go, oh, I got this person going with bunt instead of hit a home run. But this player only knows how to hit home runs and they don't know how to bunt, or vice versa. So a strategy is something that you set in place, and it lasts a long time, and it has a big impact. So a difference in tactical bombing versus strategic bombing is if I'm in a medium-sized bomber and I'm dropping bombs on the enemy a mile away from where my side is. I'm trying to blow up the tanks just as they're shooting, and I'm trying to blow up things I'm trying to blow up a train full of ammunition. If I'm going to do strategic bombing, I'm going to fly past that, and I'm going to keep flying, and I'm going to go blow up the place where they build the tanks. And I'm going to blow up the factory where they build the railroad locomotives. And I'm going to blow up the factory where they make the airplanes. Between tactical and strategic. In World War I, there was pretty much only tactical fighting with airplanes. You pretty much would just shoot down the other airplane, and then they finally got into some strafing, and they got into a little bit of bombing, but it was all right there in the war zone, in the combat zone. Strategic bombing, on the other hand, is you go past it, and you go deep into enemy territory, and one way to describe it is you destroy the enemy's ability to make weapons, or to transport weapons. Like if you're blowing up the train yards, trains aren't weapons, but they sure help get the weapons out to the front. So you're destroying their ability to make war, maybe is a better way to describe it. So that's what got invented in World War II, not in World War I. Of course, we didn't have strategic bombers in World War I, but we certainly had strategic bombers in World War II. And I could spend an hour talking about bombing in Europe in 1943 and 1944, and their first half in 1945. But the short version is, when U.S. bombers and British bombers started bombing, trying to bomb far sides of France and Germany, they would fly about halfway there, and the fighters that were flying with them were going to run out of gas. They'd be halfway empty gas. They had to turn around, and the bombers would have to go without the fighter escorts. So now those bombers, when the fighters came up, the bombers had machine guns, but a lot of them still got shot down because the bad guy fighters could just fly around and shoot the bombers, and hopefully they didn't get hit by the bombers' machine guns. But when bigger and better airplanes like a P-51 came along, that you could also put fuel tanks under the airplane, and not just fly halfway, but you could have fighter planes go all the way to the target, and whenever the enemy fighters came up, the supporting fighters that were with the bombers, they would dive off and engage the fighters, and the bombers would keep going. Yeah, you'd burn the fuel out of the tanks first, and you'd drop your drop tanks, and you'd get into a furball fighting with the fighters, but the bombers didn't stop. They kept going. So the first time this ever occurred was during World War II, and that actually was a huge event in strategic bombing, and I used to fly on a strategic bomber in the United States Air Force, so this is very interesting to me, obviously, so maybe I'm concentrating on it too much. But the fact that one could argue that one of the top several reasons why the United States and Great Britain, but mostly it was the power of the manufacturing power of the United States, won the war in Europe, is because we could take our bombers all the way from England and fly all the way into deep Germany and blow up factories that made weapons. And at first, we had really terrible losses. Literally, this is a true statement. And has anybody ever noticed in World War II, the United States Marines would go to islands, the South Pacific, like the island of Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, and there's a whole bunch of other islands. The Navy would show up, and the Marines would go off in the boats and jump on the beach and invade and take it away. You had a higher than normal probability of dying as the United States Marine Corps infantryman in World War II if you were invading these little islands in the Pacific. Think about it. A boat comes up on the beach, the door flops down, and you're running out with your gun, and you don't have any armor except your helmet. And there's people on there with bullets and machine guns, and you don't have anything to hide behind. and you're running towards the people that are shooting at you. Think about this. You're running towards the people that are shooting machine guns and howitzers and mortars. You're running towards them. So think about that for a minute. Okay. So I'm very happy that someone was willing to do that. Question? Yeah. Saving Private Ryan is when we did that in World War II in France, when we were when the United States and its allies were taking over Europe, and they invaded northern France. So it's the exact same thing. Yeah, they were running towards people that were shooting them. Usually when people shoot at me, I tend to think of running in the opposite direction, but maybe that's just me. In any case, most of the people that did that in the southern in World War II were United States Marine Corps personnel. The Army did some, but the Marines did most of it. Okay, look in 1943, and we were doing that a lot in South Pacific. And then you turn around and go to England in 1943. Before the could go all the way and back, the people who were flying bombers had noticeably greater probability of dying than the United States Marine Corps infantry did invading the islands of the South Pacific. So at that exact moment, if you said, I've got to pick between one of these two jobs, and you wanted to pick the one that you were less likely to die, you would pick the job where you jump out of a boat and you run towards people shooting at you with machine guns. That's the lesser likelihood of dying. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to belittle people that were in the United States Marine Corps doing that sort of thing. On the contrary, I think they were very heroic to do that. But people don't think about this one chunk of humans the United States had. They were flying during the daytime. The Great Britons had less bombers, and they were flying at nighttime. They were doing most of their bombing at night. They weren't as accurate. So they would just fly over cities and drop incendiary bombs and kill thousands of people at a time, or try to aim for targets, but they had more collateral damage. In the United States, we were flying in the daytime. This was the deal, because we had really good bomb sights, and we could aim really accurately, but only if we could see the target. So we went in the daytime, and the first year of doing this, the deal was that if you did 25 missions, combat missions, you'd get sent home. Now you wouldn't get out of the service; they'd make you go back to a base and be an instructor or something. In 1943, most of the people flying bombers did not live. Okay, so there I'm done ranting about strategic bombing in the United States in World War II. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Helicopter mass production occurred in the United States and in Germany. In fact, the first mass-produced helicopter in the world was actually produced in Germany. And if you type in Hanna Reich, she was a female test pilot in Germany during World War II, and they interviewed her. I saw some interviews about 10, 20 years later, 30 years later. And she flew a helicopter inside of a stadium, a closed ceiling, a stadium that had a ceiling. That was awesome. They actually built some helicopters that would hold about 10 people. And I don't know how many they built. It might have only been 5 or 10 or 20 or 30. But they didn't build a million. But technically they went into production. The United States built some 2- and 3-seat helicopters. Most of them went into the South Pacific. Ground and airborne radar, widely used, but it got more and more towards the end of the war. And when I say ground radar is where the radar is on the ground and you're looking up in the sky trying to find where the airplanes are. That's one kind of radar. Another kind of radar is you put it in the airplane so you can see where the other airplanes are so you can go try and attack them. And in fact, if you do a Google search on the P-61 Black Widow, it's a big 2-engine job. It's a fighter plane. It's a pursuit plane. P-61, P is for pursuit. And the whole design of the airplane was around a radar in the front, and they would go flying around. They painted the airplanes black, and they would fly around at night, and they would see enemy aircraft. And of course, you got to figure out, is it a good person? Is it the good guys or the bad guys? And other aircraft, you can't hear other airplanes when you're in the air. And if the airplane didn't have radar pointed at them, so they'd come up behind them and shoot them out of the sky. So you're sitting there in your airplane, and then all of a sudden, bullets impact your body. Don't you hate that? I hate that. I mean, I think I would hate that. I don't recall having that being a problem. Okay, Loran is a long-range. Oh, it's 3 o'clock. I know. I was just getting riled up there. I'll see you gentlemen tomorrow is Friday.